The massive auditorium of the Galactic Military Academy buzzed with excited chatter as dozens of young alien officers filled the curved seats. Representatives from across the galaxy had gathered here. Tall, elegant Altarians with their crystal blue skin, stocky Krogan warriors with their thick armor plating, and sleek Zephyrians whose tentacles moved like liquid mercury. At the center of it all sat the guest speaker they had all come to see. Commander Zethkalar limped slowly to the raised platform, his mechanical leg whirring softly with each step. The Vorthon's once proud carapace was a map of old battles. Deep scars crisscrossed his chest where plasma bolts had found their mark, and his left arm had been replaced entirely with a sophisticated cybernetic limb that gleamed under the Academy's bright lights. Most striking of all was the empty socket where his right eye should have been, now fitted with a red optical implant that tracked the room with mechanical precision. The old warrior's remaining mandibles clicked as he surveyed the eager faces before him. These younglings had never seen real war, never watched entire star systems burn or heard the death screams of battleships as they broke apart in the void. They sat there in their pristine uniforms, drinking in tales of glory like sweet nectar. "So, Commander," called out a young Altarian officer, his voice carrying the typical arrogance of his species, "we've heard you fought in over 200 battles across 40 star systems. Which enemy was the most dangerous? The Hive Collective with their endless swarms? The Shadow Syndicate with their planet-killer weapons?" Zethkalar's optical implant whirred as it focused on the speaker. For a long moment the auditorium fell, silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravelly, worn down by decades of shouting orders over the roar of battle. "Humans," he said simply. The reaction was immediate. Laughter rippled through the crowd like waves on a beach. A Krogan cadet snorted so hard that his breathing apparatus fogged up. Even the usually composed Zephyrians allowed their tentacles to twitch with amusement. "Humans?" The Altarian officer's crystal blue features twisted into a condescending smile. "Commander, with all due respect, humans only achieved faster-than-light travel 15 rotations ago. They're barely out of their atomic age. Half their planet still uses fossil fuels for energy. They don't even have proper plasma weapons, yet." More chuckles echoed through the chamber. A young Krogan officer leaned forward in his seat. "My tactical studies professor says human military technology is at least 3 centuries behind galactic standard. Their biggest warships are smaller than our escort frigates. Their soldiers still use projectile weapons," added a Zephyrian, her melodic voice dripping with disdain. "Crude metal slugs propelled by chemical explosives. It's almost primitive." Zethkalar listened to their mockery in silence, his mechanical fingers drumming against the podium. His optical implant cycled through different vision modes: infrared, electromagnetic, tactical analysis, a nervous habit he'd developed since losing his natural eye to human small arms fire 3 years ago. "Primitive," he repeated slowly, tasting the word like bitter medicine. "Yes, that's what we all thought." The laughter began to die down as something in his tone shifted. The old commander reached into his uniform jacket and pulled out a small data pad. With practiced movements, he connected it to the auditorium's holographic display system. The lights dimmed automatically as the massive projector hummed to life. "Let me tell you about Primitive," Zethkalar continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Yet in the sudden quiet, every word carried clearly to the back rows. "Let me tell you about the day I learned that technological superiority means nothing when you're facing a species that treats death like an old friend." The holographic display flickered, then resolved into a 3-dimensional star map. A small blue-green world hung suspended in the center, slowly rotating. Earth, third planet from an unremarkable yellow star in what the galaxy's cataloging systems designated as Sector 7 Alpha. This was supposed to be a simple first contact mission, Zethkalar said, his mechanical leg servo whining as he shifted his weight. The Galactic Council had detected radio transmissions from this system. Basic electromagnetic communications, the kind every species develops just before they discover faster-than-light physics. We expected to find another civilization of peaceful traders, maybe some useful agricultural techniques or interesting art forms. His mandibles clicked again, faster now. The sound was barely audible, but those familiar with Vorthan physiology knew it indicated extreme stress. Instead, we found something that would change how every military academy in the galaxy teaches warfare. The star map zoomed in, showing Earth's single moon and the primitive space stations orbiting the planet. We found humans. The auditorium had fallen completely silent now. Even the usual background hum of the Academy's life support systems seemed muted. Zeth Kalar's optical implant glowed brighter as he prepared to begin his tale, knowing that by the time he finished, these young officers would never think of warfare the same way again. The holographic display shifted, showing a massive industrial complex floating in the void between two gas giants. Kepler mining station stretched for kilometers, its metal framework bristling with extraction equipment, processing plants, and cargo bays. The structure looked like a mechanical spider web against the starfield, all angles and support beams designed for function over beauty. Kepler Station was the largest mining operation in the Outer Rim. Zeth Kalar began, his optical implant focusing on different sections of the hologram. 17 different species worked there, extracting rare minerals from the asteroid fields. The station housed over 50,000 civilians, miners, engineers, families. It was supposed to be neutral territory, protected by the Galactic Mining Consortium. The display zoomed in to show the station's defensive systems, a handful of outdated plasma turrets and a small security force. Clearly, it had been built for mining, not warfare. Then the Hive Collective decided they wanted the mineral rights for themselves. Dark shapes materialized around the station in the hologram. Hive bioships were unlike anything else in the galaxy, living vessels that looked more grown than built. Their hulls pulsed with veins of bioluminescent fluid, and weapon pods sprouted from their surfaces like infected growths. The creatures piloting them were even worse, insectoid horrors that viewed all other life as either food or obstacles to remove. A young Krogan officer leaned forward. The Hive never takes prisoners. Everyone knows that. Exactly, Zeth Kalar nodded grimly. When long-range sensors detected the Hive fleet approaching, panic spread through the station like wildfire. The evacuation order came down within minutes. All non-essential personnel to the transport ships, immediate departure for the nearest safe system. The hologram showed dozens of civilian transports launching from the station's docking bays, their engines burning bright as they fled into hyperspace. Ship after ship departed, loaded with refugees from across the galaxy. Most species followed standard protocol. The Altarian research team was gone within an hour. The Zephyrian trade delegation didn't even wait for the all-clear. They launched the moment they heard Hive was coming. The Krogan security contractors fulfilled their contracts and left on the last official transport. The display now showed an almost empty station, its corridors eerily quiet except for the skeleton crew, needed to maintain basic systems. But there was one group that stayed behind. Zeth Kalar's mandibles clicked slowly. 200 human Marines from the Terran Defense Corps. They weren't even officially assigned to the station. They were just passing through on a routine patrol when the alert came in. A young Altarian officer tilted her head. They stayed. To help with the evacuation? The evacuation was complete, Zeth Kalar replied. Every civilian transport had launched. Every escape pod was gone. The station was empty except for those 200 humans and a handful of volunteers from other species who chose to remain. The smart thing, the logical thing, would have been to leave with the others. His optical implant glowed brighter as he accessed deeper memory files. I asked their commanding officer why they didn't evacuate. He was a grizzled veteran named Captain Rodriguez, probably the toughest human I'd ever met. You know what he told me? The auditorium waited in silence. He said, "Someone has to slow them down. Those transports need time to reach the hyperspace jump point. If the Hive gets through here too quickly, they'll catch the civilian ships before they escape." The hologram shifted to show the approaching Hive fleet, hundreds of bioships swarming toward the station like angry insects. Their estimated arrival time appeared in red numbers, 3 hours. The human Marines had 3 hours to turn a mining station into a fortress. What they did next? Zethkalar paused, his mechanical fingers tapping against the podium. It changed how I think about warfare forever. The display showed the interior of the station as the humans got to work. They moved with mechanical precision, but also with a creativity that defied military logic. Industrial mining lasers were repositioned to fire down major corridors. Cargo containers filled with explosive mining charges were stacked at strategic choke points. They turned the station's own infrastructure into weapons. Plasma cutters became automated defense turrets. The main ore processing plant was rigged to explode and take out an entire section of the station. They even weaponized the artificial gravity generators. Imagine having the floor suddenly become the ceiling during a firefight. As Zephyrian officers, tentacles writhed with discomfort. That's highly irregular tactics. Irregular doesn't begin to describe it, Zethkalar continued. When I watched the security footage later, I found traps that shouldn't have been possible. They had turned the station's coffee makers into improvised explosive devices. Cleaning supply dispensers became chemical weapons. Even the toilet facilities were booby-trapped. The young officers shifted in their seats, clearly disturbed by the implications. But the most terrifying part wasn't their creativity with traps, it was their attitude. The hologram now showed human Marines preparing for battle, checking their weapons and equipment. Their faces were calm, almost peaceful. They knew they were going to die. The mathematics were simple. 200 humans against 3,000. Hive warriors with no possibility of escape or reinforcement, yet they prepared for battle like they were heading to a routine training exercise. The display showed the Hive fleet arriving, bioships swarming around the station like predators circling wounded prey. The battle began immediately. The holographic display flickered and changed, now showing the vast emptiness of space near the Proxima Centauri system. Stars dotted the darkness like scattered diamonds, but the scene was far from peaceful. Zethkalar's optical implant whirred as he accessed another set of memory files. These ones marked with the highest military classification codes. 6 months after Kepler Station, I encountered humans again. The old commander began, his mechanical leg servo clicking as he shifted position. This time, it was a proper fleet engagement. The Shadow Syndicate had been raiding civilian shipping lanes for months, using their new stealth destroyers to attack merchant convoys and disappear before help could arrive. The hologram materialized dozens of sleek, angular ships, Shadow Syndicate vessels with their characteristic dark hulls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their weapons glowed with purple energy, and their hulls bristled with advanced shield generators and cloaking devices. The Galactic Council decided to send a joint task force to deal with the problem. 27 ships from 5 different species, including my own battle cruiser. We thought it would be a simple police action. Find the raiders, disable their ships, arrest the crews. A young Altarian officer raised her hand. What went wrong? Zethkalar's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. Intelligence went wrong. The Shadow Syndicate wasn't just raiding shipping lanes. They were building a fleet. When we dropped out of hyperspace, we found ourselves facing over 300 enemy vessels, including several dreadnoughts we didn't even know existed. The holographic display exploded with activity as hundreds of shadow ships materialized around the small task force. The enemy vessels moved like sharks, circling wounded prey, their weapons charging with ominous purple light. Standard military doctrine in that situation is clear. Retreat, regroup, call for reinforcements. The Altarian ships jumped to hyperspace immediately. The Zephyrian squadron followed 30 seconds later. Even my own people began preparing for withdrawal. The display showed ships disappearing one by one as they fled to safety, leaving behind only a small cluster of vessels in the center of the enemy formation. But the human contingent refused to retreat. Admiral Chen, commanding the Earth Defense Force Squadron, opened a channel to all remaining ships. She said something I'll never forget. We came here to stop these pirates from hurting innocent people. Running away now just means more civilians die tomorrow. Zethkalar's optical implant focused on the human ships in the display. They were smaller than most galactic standard vessels, with angular hulls covered in armor plating and bristling with what looked like primitive projectile weapons. 12 ships total, a heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers, and 7 fighters that looked like they'd been built for atmospheric flight rather than space combat. 12 human ships against 300 enemy vessels. The odds were hopeless, but they formed up in battle formation anyway. I stayed to watch, thinking I might record their final moments for the historical archives. The battle began with a massive barrage from the Shadow Fleet. Purple energy beams lanced through space, striking the human formation with devastating force. Shields flared and died. Armor plated peeled away in molten streams, and atmosphere vented from hull breaches like blood from wounds. The human flagship took direct hits from 6 dreadnoughts simultaneously. Her shields collapsed, her main engines went dark, and fires spread through half her hull. Any sensible commander would have surrendered or tried to escape in the remaining lifeboats. The hologram zoomed in on the crippled human cruiser as it drifted helplessly, its hull glowing red-hot from internal fires. Escape pods should have been launching, distress signals should have been broadcasting, but instead something impossible happened. Admiral Chen ordered all power diverted to the remaining engines. The flagship, a ship that should have been dead in space, suddenly accelerated directly toward the largest Shadow dreadnought. No weapons fire, no attempts to maneuver for a better attack angle. Just a straight ram course at maximum possible speed. The young officers watched in stunned silence as the burning human cruiser slammed into the enemy flagship. The explosion lit up the entire battlefield, and when the light faded, both massive ships were gone. Nothing left but expanding clouds of superheated debris. But that was just the beginning, Zeth-Kalar continued, his voice growing quieter. The human destroyers didn't retreat after losing their flagship. They attacked. Their fighter pilots, flying ships that were already damaged and leaking atmosphere, turned their vessels into guided missiles. I watched a human pilot whose cockpit had been breached continue his attack run, while wearing nothing but an emergency pressure suit, steering his fighter into the engine core of a Shadow battleship. The display showed the chaotic battle as human ships, many of them visibly damaged and trailing debris, continued their relentless assault. One destroyer, its hull split almost in half, kept firing its weapons even as crew sections vented into space. The most disturbing part wasn't their tactics or their refusal to surrender. It was the sounds coming over their communication channels. Zeth-Kalar activated an audio file, and the auditorium filled with human voices singing in harmony. The melody was haunting, almost beautiful, but the context made it deeply unsettling. They were singing, he explained as the music played. War songs from their home planet, ancient battle hymns about warriors who died gloriously in combat. The Shadow Syndicate crews had never encountered anything like it. Here was a species that didn't just accept death in battle, they celebrated it. The holographic display shifted once more, showing a peaceful star system with several inhabited worlds orbiting a gentle orange sun. The planets looked serene from space. Blue oceans, green continents, white cloud formations that spoke of thriving ecosystems. But as the image zoomed closer, the signs of devastation became clear. The Tau Ceti system, Zeth-Kalar announced, his optical implant dimming as he accessed particularly disturbing memory files. 3 inhabited worlds, home to nearly 2 billion sentient beings from a dozen different species. Agricultural planets. Mostly, they grew food for half the Outer Rim colonies. The display showed cities that had been reduced to smoking ruins, vast farmlands turned into barren wastelands, and orbital installations hanging dark and lifeless in space. Refugee ships crowded around the outer planets like metal insects swarming over rotting fruit. The Zephyrian slave syndicate had been raiding these worlds for months. Not for resources or territory, for people. They specialized in capturing entire populations and selling them to work camps in the unexplored regions beyond galactic space. A young Krogan officer growled low in his throat. Slavers are the lowest form of life in the galaxy. Even pirates have more honor. The local defense forces couldn't stop them, Zeth-Kalar continued. Zephyrian ships were too fast, too well armed. They would drop out of hyperspace, snatch a few thousand civilians, and disappear before anyone could respond. The Galactic Council was still debating military intervention when the humans arrived. The hologram showed a small fleet of human vessels dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Only 8 ships, a mix of cruisers and destroyers, that looked crude compared to the sleek Zephyrian raiders they were hunting. I was part of the Council observation team, there to document the situation and recommend action. We expected the humans to patrol the system, maybe set up some defensive positions around the populated worlds. Standard peacekeeping protocol. The display tracked the human fleet as it moved through the system, but instead of taking defensive positions, the ships spread out in a complex search pattern. Their sensors swept every asteroid field, every gas cloud, every possible hiding spot in the vast emptiness between worlds. What the humans did next showed a level of tactical thinking that surprised even our best military analysts. Instead of protecting the planets, they went hunting. They had somehow calculated the exact locations where the Zephyrian ships would emerge from hyperspace for their next raid. The ambush, when it came, was swift and brutal. Zephyrian raiders materialized, right into the waiting guns of the human fleet. The hologram showed the enemy ships caught completely off guard, their shields down and weapons unpowered as they prepared for what should have been an easy raid on defenseless civilians. The battle lasted 17 minutes, Zethkalar said, his mechanical fingers drumming against the podium. When it was over, 12 Zephyrian raider ships were either destroyed or disabled. But here's where it gets interesting and disturbing. The display zoomed in on the aftermath of the battle. Several Zephyrian ships floated dead in space, their hulls cracked open and atmosphere venting into the void. But scattered throughout the debris field were escape pods and life rafts, emergency beacons flashing desperately in the darkness. Standard military protocol when dealing with slavers is simple: no prisoners. Slavers who are captured usually end up spacing themselves rather than face trial, because the penalty is always execution. Quick, clean, final justice. A Zephyrian officer in the audience shifted uncomfortably, her tentacles curling with obvious distress. Everyone knew her species' reputation, even if most Zephyrians had rejected the criminal activities of the slave syndicates. The humans rescued every single survivor, Zethkalar continued, his optical implant focusing on individual escape pods being tractored into human cargo bays. Over 400 Zephyrian slavers, including their fleet commander and his entire senior staff. We expected executions within hours. The hologram shifted to show the interior of a human ship's holding bay, the captured Zephyrians huddled together, their elegant forms reduced to trembling prisoners awaiting death. But instead of execution chambers, human medical teams moved among them, treating injuries and providing food and water. Instead of killing them, the humans did something that confused every military observer in the system. They put the slavers on trial. Not summary execution, not spacing, an actual legal proceeding with evidence, witnesses, and defense attorneys. The young officers in the auditorium exchanged bewildered glances. This wasn't how warfare was supposed to work. Enemies were eliminated, not given lawyers. The trials lasted 3 weeks. Every slaver was found guilty, of course. The evidence was overwhelming. But then came the sentencing, and this is where human psychology becomes truly alien to the rest of us. The display showed work crews in environmental suits, laboring to rebuild the devastated cities on the Tau Ceti worlds. But as the image focused closer, it became clear that many of the workers were Zephyrians, the same slavers who had destroyed these places. Community service, Zethkalar said, his mandibles clicking with what might have been amazement or horror. The humans sentenced the slavers to rebuild everything they had destroyed, not for a few months or even a few years, for the rest of their natural lives. Every building they had bombed, every farm they had burned, every life they had disrupted. Young Altarian officer raised her hand. But surely they tried to escape. Slavers aren't known for their work ethic. That's what made it so disturbing, Zethkalar replied. The humans didn't use chains or force fields or guard towers. They used something far more effective. They gave the prisoners hope. Every slaver who worked diligently for 5 years without causing trouble earned the right to send a message home to their families. 10 years of good behavior meant supervised visits from relatives. 20 years, and they could apply for limited freedom within the system. The hologram showed the reconstruction efforts over time, Ruined cities slowly rising from their ashes, dead farmlands turning green again, and throughout it all, former slavers working alongside the very people they had once terrorized. But here's the part that terrified other species, Zeth-Kalar continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The humans didn't just make the slavers rebuild the worlds, they made them understand what they had destroyed. The auditorium had fallen into complete silence as Zeth-Kalar's final words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The old commander's optical implant swept across the faces of the young officers, noting how their expressions had changed over the course of his tales. The arrogant smirks were gone now, replaced by something deeper, a mixture of fascination and fear that he had seen on countless battlefields across the galaxy. "You think those stories are the end of it?" Zeth-Kalar said quietly, his mechanical leg whirring as he stepped closer to the edge of the platform. "You think I've told you about human warfare so you can prepare defenses against it, develop countermeasures, maybe even find ways to defeat them if the need ever arises." The holographic display flickered to life one final time, but instead of showing Earth or human ships, it displayed a sprawling military base on Alteria Prime. The elegant crystal spires that usually characterized Alterian architecture had been replaced by angular, functional buildings that looked strikingly familiar. "This is the Alterian Military Academy's new training facility," Zeth-Kalar announced. "Notice anything different about the design?" A young Alterian officer in the front row leaned forward, his crystal blue features creasing with confusion. "Those buildings, they look like human military structures." "Exactly." The display shifted to show Alterian soldiers moving through training courses. But these weren't the graceful, ritualized combat forms that had defined Alterian warfare for millennia. Instead, they were practicing brutal, efficient techniques: urban warfare, improvised explosive deployment, psychological warfare tactics. 6. Months after the Battle of Proxima Centauri, the Alterian High Command completely rewrote their military doctrine. They studied every human engagement they could find, analyzed every tactical decision, and started training their soldiers to think like humans. The hologram changed again, now showing a Centauri weapons facility. The insectoid engineers worked frantically at assembly lines, but the devices they were building didn't match traditional Centauri technology. These weapons were rough, functional, designed for maximum damage rather than elegant efficiency. The Centauri Collective has abandoned 3 centuries of weapon development philosophy. They're now mass-producing what they call human pattern armaments, crude, reliable, and devastatingly effective. Their engineers say these weapons have twice the battlefield performance of their previous designs. A Zephyrian officer's tentacles writhed with obvious discomfort. But surely these are isolated incidents, a few species experimenting with new tactics? Zeth-Kalar's mandibles clicked in what might have been dark amusement. "Show him the fleet deployment reports from the outer rim." The holographic display expanded to show dozens of star systems, each one marked with military deployment indicators. What had once been a patchwork of different tactical approaches now showed disturbing uniformity. Fleet formations that emphasized aggressive assault over defensive positioning, supply lines designed for rapid deployment rather than sustainable logistics, recruitment programs that prioritized adaptability and psychological resilience over traditional military virtues. 17. Different species have restructured their entire military organizations based on human tactics, Zeth-Kalar continued. The Rigelian Star Navy has adopted human-style boarding actions. The Vegan colonial marines now train their soldiers to use improvised weapons. Even the peaceful Andromedans have started teaching their defense forces what they call creative problem-solving under extreme stress. The young officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the implications became clear. This wasn't just about humans being dangerous, it was about humans changing the very nature of warfare across the galaxy. But that's not the worst part, Zeth-Kalar said, his optical implant glowing brighter as he accessed his most classified files. The worst part is that it's working. The display showed battle reports from across the galaxy. Conflicts that had been stalemates for decades suddenly resolved in weeks. terrorist organizations that had been untouchable for generations, eliminated in surgical strikes. Pirate fleets that had plagued entire sectors scattered by forces a tenth their size. Military effectiveness across the galaxy has increased by an average of 40% since species started adopting human tactics. Wars that should have lasted years are ending in months. Problems that were considered unsolvable are being solved, with applications of creative violence that our ancestors never imagined. A young Krogan officer, his armor plates bristling with agitation, spoke up. "So humans have made us all better warriors. What's wrong with that?" Zeth Kalar's remaining eye fixed on the speaker with an intensity that made several nearby officers flinch. "Because humans don't fight wars, young one, they fight legends." The holographic display shifted one final time, showing footage from human entertainment broadcasts. Movies, games, stories that depicted impossible heroes accomplishing impossible tasks against impossible odds. But mixed in with the fiction were real battle recordings. Human soldiers doing things that defied military logic and somehow succeeding. "Look at their popular culture," Zeth Kalar said. "Every human story is about ordinary individuals becoming extraordinary through sheer determination. They don't fight to protect territory or resources or even their lives. They fight to become the kind of warriors that other species tell stories about 1,000 years later." The old commander limped to the center of the platform, his mechanical parts whirring softly in the sudden quiet. "And here's the terrifying part. They're teaching that philosophy to everyone else. The Altarians who adopted human tactics aren't just fighting more effectively. They're fighting with human motivation. They want to be heroes in the stories their grandchildren will tell." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Warfare wasn't just becoming more efficient, it was becoming more personal, more desperate, more willing to embrace impossible odds for the chance at impossible glory. "Other species fight to win," Zeth Kalar concluded, his voice echoing in the silent auditorium. "Humans fight to become legends, and somehow, impossibly, they succeed. Now they're teaching the rest of the galaxy to do the same." The young officers began filing out slowly, their excited chatter from earlier replaced by contemplative silence. They had come expecting tales of distant battles and exotic enemies. Instead, they had learned that the most dangerous force in the galaxy wasn't a weapon or a fleet or even a species. It was an idea that spread like a virus, turning ordinary soldiers into legends and practical warfare into mythology. As the last of the students disappeared through the auditorium doors, Zeth Kalar remained on the platform, staring at a small hologram of Earth that still floated in the display. The blue-green world looked so peaceful, so unremarkable. It was hard to believe that such a simple planet had produced the species that was reshaping galactic civilization, one battle at a time. His optical implant cycled through different vision modes as he studied the image, and for the first time in decades, the old warrior found himself wondering whether his own people should fear or admire the humans. Perhaps, he thought grimly, there was no difference anymore.